Good evening. I hope you guys are doing well. Tonight I'm going to talk about vocabulary and teaching vocabulary. This is connected to Harmer's section on grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation. I'm going to start with vocabulary because you don't have to teach grammar or pronunciation unless you're including vocabulary, because it is the key to unlocking language use. First, when we think of vocabulary, I want you to marvel at how much you know. Adults who speak English know 30,000 words. That's around 5,000 root words, and you can use 90% of these in multiple forms. So that makes, like 1,000,000 words. It's amazing. You know culturally, appropriacy, context, when and how to use a word, how green is the White House. You understand that. You know how to spell words that have nothing to do with their sound, which is the amazing thing about English. And you did this automatically. You really probably didn't have a whole lot of flashcards except for academic words or new words in a new kind of context, but just your basic vocabulary just came to you for listening and speaking just by being around people. And then, this is probably in your first language, but in your second language you had to study, or in a new subject area you have to study certain vocabulary words. And what you do when you learn a new vocabulary word is you attach that word to other things that you know. So it's important that we help our students attach the new vocabulary words that they're learning to other things that they know. First and foremost is to other English words that they know, so that they're not constantly relying on translation. And then what we have to think about are what words should they know. So we need to teach words of frequency. There are sight words, which are best learned through memorization. These are things like the, an, a, are, is. They happen right in the first chapter of any textbook. Hi, how are you? That entire sentence is sight words. So we would not teach that sentence word by word, translation by translation. We would just teach it as a word chunk. We might give an equivalency in their language, but automatically we would assume that they can memorize that chunk of words. Things like apple or chair, those are also tend to be sight words, but they require a little more memorization because of the spelling and the structure and the complexity and the use. Next, we would go into the 2,000 general service words. Once they know the 2,000 general service words, then you can go and beyond and go into the academic word list. And so Averill Cox had actually studied all the words that are used in academic and professional settings. And there's about 570 most commonly used academic and professional words, but they're word families. So there's 10 sublists. You study them in order. Sublist 1 is the most common, sublist 2, and then sublist 10 is the least common. And actually, if you took the test, you probably didn't even get to sublist 10, because if you miss 5 in a row, then that's where you stop at your vocabulary level. So most of us don't even reach, as native speakers, necessarily sublist 10. You teach them in order, and you teach them in many varied ways, which I'm about to talk about. You start with the basics, though. So when you have beginning students, you start with sight words, and this means that you have nouns, pictures, objects, and they memorize words, and they do translate. So they would have a chair, and then in Hungarian, it's zik, and then they would learn both simultaneously, using pictures, objects, relia, the real things. And then you would have kindergarten sight words, a whole list of them, and those are the words that I just told you that are in the general service list, but we tend not to make flashcards for these. We just introduce them, have them look at them, have them see them in context, and then they memorize them. Okay, so you know certain words and you understand that they have different meanings. So when you look at the phrase lose, we know that we associate this word with the loss of items, like car keys, cell phones, things that we lose. But when you see learners have to understand the multiple ways that we use the same word in English, even though it has nothing to do with that, like losing a cop or losing sleep or losing a loved one, have very different meanings than losing your keys. So at some point in your lessons, if you're teaching a new word, you need to be conscious of these multiple meanings and teach these meanings to them directly. Many students focus on translation of a word from their L1 to target language. They think this is the sole and best way to learn words. And in fact, that is not true, because meaning is not really understanding a word. So this is only one aspect of a word that they need to know, the meaning. So you give them a list of words. They look them up in the dictionary, like cold, freezing. Okay, freezing below 32 degrees, 0 degrees Celsius. Oh, that's fagyja in my language, Hungarian. Your vocabulary test state, the room was freezing, so she put on a sweater. At this point, the word is being taken out of the literal context of 32 degrees or freezing, because you wouldn't just put on a sweater if the room was freezing. You might leave the room. You might, there's many things that you would do. So it's kind of a weird way to use it, but it's a common way that we use it. Does their definition of freezing make sense anymore? Not really. There's probably other ways of viewing the word freezing. So at some point we have to help our students explore different ways of looking at words, and those are all of the meanings that happen. Meaning, pronunciation, grammar, how to use it in a sentence, word families, that's the prefix and the suffix and how we change it, and it changes from a noun to an adjective to a adverb, and words that occur with this word, that's collocations, along with appropriateness and register, so that they understand when you call someone a freezing type of woman, you understand what they mean by that. She's not actually freezing. She's just very cold in her demeanor and personality, which is a common way of using that in films. So basically, when you're teaching a word, it is great to look at the varieties of a word, and helping students grow their vocabulary is to give them more challenging words. So I like this example of this chart because the teacher has taken these very simple words, cold, hot, hungry, that the majority of our intermediate learners know, and then expanding their vocabulary so that they can use more difficult and exact words. So angry versus furious and livid, for example. And that's a natural way of expanding your students' vocabulary. Again, you're taking the English that they know, and then you're growing that into something greater. So to reiterate, knowing a word means knowing the definition, the meaning, but within the context of how that word was being used. And that will help you with seeing collocation so that they see what words go around that word. One of the funny words that I always have to teach is environment, and people will misuse environment, environmental. The environment is a problem. This environment is unclean or unsafe, like seeing how do we use this word within a sentence. And those are also the grammatical features and the word parts of speech. That's noun, verb, adjective. And if it's a phrase, then you can't separate the phrase out and break it apart. It always goes together. And then finally, and most hilariously, is always appropriateness, because when they misuse a word in formality or informality, it can be very funny. On the next slide, I have examples. Here you see your layers of word knowledge. So there's the positive and negative. The woman is skinny. That's not very flattering. Degree, the records are annihilated after 4 years. That's an inappropriate use of annihilated. There's fixed phrases that we just don't use. Large sums of people were present. And as you see your students writing and speaking, and you hear it, you'll see that sometimes they're making these errors, and they're not grammar errors. These are specifically vocabulary errors. It's that they don't know how to use these words appropriately. Parts of speech, it's very common. It's rude to bubble the gum in someone's face. They're assuming that bubble can be used as a verb, just like a whole bunch of other words. The car is spewing exhaust is funny, but we don't say that. And the formal and informal can be very detrimental if they said, hey, dude, to their boss, this kind of thing. So teaching all these aspects of a word are very important. Okay, so how do we help our students learn the new words and notice new words? It's through words consciousness raising activities. So we're going to teach them that as we're recognizing words in readings, and we usually do it through reading or through short dialogues, but not through like long listenings. Long listenings, we would be reinforcing vocabulary that they've already learned. And I'll get more into that when I teach listening and speaking and reading and writing. So for reading, you can introduce new words. That's where we typically do this. So some words will make sense and others don't. So we have to teach the rules. Like teachers teach, yes. We drive in a parkway, we park in a driveway. But like, doctors don't doct, and we already have silly words like that. So we have to explain to our students that yes, in English you can often take a noun and turn it into a verb and it matches, but not always. And you have to teach these rules, but also the exceptions of the rules. Okay, when the patterns don't exist, they need to know that. Fingers don't ping, and they need to understand. The simplest way to do this is just through discussion. As they see a new word and they meet a new word in the text or in context, you just talk about it and explain. So with more advanced students, you would be very specific. Yeah, see this word sibling. When you talk to your friend, would you say, this is my sibling? Or would you say, this is my brother, or this is my sister? So you're explaining formality and usefulness of these words. Fraudulent is different from dishonest, but how? And one is illegal, one is troublesome, and maybe cheating on a boyfriend or something. That's dishonest. But fraudulent is that you actually broke the law. So understanding degree. You might use the word kids in speaking, but what might you use in writing? And the answer is children. We don't write kids in traditional papers, maybe in a literary paper when we're trying to produce speech. So another way with beginners is that you compare to their own language or to other objects. So an apple is red like a ball is red or something like that. And so you're making them notice the color again and again. Or in Chinese, you say, 我喜欢苹果. In English, how is this different? Yeah, because we use plurals, 2 apples. But in your language, you say 2个苹果. You're counting using a counter, but I have to add an S and you have to add an S. So let's add S's. So that's explaining rules and things through consciousness raising and understanding that you probably shouldn't learn the word apple without learning the word apples pretty quickly. You can also raise their awareness of why we use certain words together. So what is wrong with these unclear examples? And you can literally write this down and let me know what you think the answer is. The boys made their homework. The volcano wasn't working. He is at least 6 feet high. Do you know why we can't say these things in English? They're grammatically correct, but there is a reason. Make your guess and tell me when you see me again or write it in your response. Noticing register or appropriateness and the mean is within context. So when you see something in context that is appropriate, you might point out that this is appropriate because, or you might notice that it's inappropriate. So in the Calvin and Hobbes, the teacher's question wasn't written correctly for Calvin. Most students understood that they needed to just not copy the definition. Textbooks will also have some inappropriate things. So like there's a picture of a family and then they say the woman is fat, the man is tall, the boy has a beautiful blue sweater. All of that is inappropriate for the most part. I mean, other than the man is tall. But in this case, he isn't tall, so that's what you'll notice in the book sometimes, that they're using like adjectives, they're using descriptors, they're using things that would be uncomfortable. And it's important that we point that out to our students and teach them at that moment that this is how we would use that. And they can put a little note in their book or somewhere so that they learn immediately how it is that they should be using words. Although like teaching vocabulary sort of seems like, oh, I just use flashcards and I just have fun and I make sure my students learn words. But keep in mind some principles. There's the frequency principle. We really need to focus on the words that they need to learn. Don't just teach every word and get them out of the habit of translating and trying to learn every single word because probably they don't need to. The other thing is the repetition principle. The assumption is that they have to see a word 13 times in different ways in order to even learn a word. And that means reading, writing, listening, speaking, and in different parts of the sentences or in different contexts. To actually know and remember a word and know all of its parts and meaning is very complicated and takes time, and we use spaced retrieval. That means that they see the new words often within the first exposure to the word, sort of like flashcards, using them in class, and also repetition throughout the week. So you would plan, these are the new words that we're going to cover in our listening section, our speaking section, our reading section, our writing section, and you would introduce the same words throughout, and then you would kind of recycle them again a couple weeks later, and you keep building on them. Avoid interference. So these are words that are too similar, but they're different. So like hot and cold. If you teach hot and cold together, usually they will mix them up. And they will always forever not know which one's hot and which one's cold and say it wrong. Another one is if it's something like in their own language that has the opposite meaning but a similar sound, that could interrupt. Or you can start with the same sound or prefix. So if you did like cooperate, co-teach, coexist, and something, everything's they would get confused and they would never learn those. Even the same letter, starting with the same letter, all of them will really confuse. So make sure that when you look at the sub list, it's very helpful because they've actually divided them up, not in alphabetical order, but in usefulness. Like this is a word that you will most likely actually read somewhere. The other thing is this generation principle. So let them see the words in different ways, in different forms. That was where I said, do listening, speaking, reading, writing, do all the activities with the same vocabulary words where you're highlighting them again and again. And don't teach too many words. That's the main problem. So 20 is reasonable per week. Anything beyond 20 is unlikely that they would learn them or want to learn them or memorize them. They would just be translating and kind of wasting time. So when you're teaching vocabulary words, you need to provide examples of words. So when they meet a word that they don't know, they're going to ask you like, what does sprint mean, teacher? And you're going to say, sprint is like run. And that will be your first example. And you're like running. And then, but you'll say, but it's faster and shorter than running. Or you can give a synonym of run, sprint, run. Or you can give the antonym, slowly going. You can also give situational context. The runner in the Olympics sprints, and then you could show it even a picture or a video. Rely a picture is very useful. Or you can make the gesture. You can do the running. Or you can pantomime and demonstrate. Worst comes to worse, translate. But you should try to go through the steps of teaching a word before giving up and saying, let's just translate the word. The point that was brought up in teaching words is that you need to teach collocations. It's sometimes hard to include collocations, but it's important that especially your intermediate and advanced learners understand that certain words go together in English and they just make sense that way. We don't even really have rules or reasons. It's just what we do. So there's adjective noun combos like thick stomach. We don't say that. We say fat stomach. Verb noun combo, the prices levitated. No, the prices rise. Metaphorical, spend money versus spend time. Okay, I spend money, I spend time. One is positive, maybe one is negative, whatever, versus waste money, waste time. Understanding that we always put these things together. Connotation based, we don't say provide harm or cause solutions. We say that causes harms and I will provide a solution. So how do you teach this? First, you do noticing activities. You just have those words within whatever they're listening to or reading, and you let them notice. Say, what are the words around it? How do you use that word? Try to make a sentence using the same structure on your own. Matching activities. Have them match the things that actually go together. And teach word pals. Just say, these words go together. And that's just basic noticing. Some collocations are based on compound words. So nuclear family, bookcase. So in the beginning, you actually teach a lot of compound words in English. That's an important part of learning English. Phrasal verbs are another one, and they're very tricky, and you can do matching games, and basically you just bring them up now and again, and when they're in a reading, you highlight them. Turn on, give away, get off. All of these things are phrasal verbs, and there's a whole list of them online. Lexical phrases are important too. We use them 10 to 1. Things like, what on earth? And when you kind of include those in role plays or in speaking activities, they'll just become really natural at using great lexical phrases. Idioms are another one. Meaning is never known by its parts. Green thumb, thin skin, 2 left feet. These have to be taught directly and explicitly, and they need to be within context of role plays or readings, newspapers, places where you see idioms often. And you have to become aware of, where do I use idioms? Where do I use lexical phrases? What kind of phrasal verbs am I using? And what kind of compound words do I typically use? Cell phone, social media, those types of things. Once you teach them idioms, you can take a look at these idioms and see what's wrong with them. You can also look at these and define them and say, well, what do they mean? And you can also think of other ones like it that we have in English, or you can say, we don't even use these anymore. Like on cloud 7 is on cloud 9, and we rarely use that. But let it go, not let it come, is something that we do use a lot. So deciding which ones we actually use and which ones they need, and teaching those idioms. And idioms are generally very fun and fruitful for lessons for intermediate to advanced students. These are phrasal verb matching games. I make 2 cards, put them into little piles, and then they match them. So we would have done this in class. You can just look at them and say, oh, okay, get up is a common one. Make sense of something, right? And for pregnant, it's get pregnant. These are things that sometimes you'll notice in your students' writing or speaking that they're using incorrectly, and then you would teach the correct phrasal verbs, and you would do these kinds of matching and vocabulary card games. If you're doing a reading that has a few of these kind of phrasal structures where you can't flip them, like forth and back, we don't say, we say back and forth. He went back and forth between wanting to join the team and not. If you see that, then you can teach that you can't flip it around and that it doesn't make sense in English, and it will help them to recognize them, see them, and use them correctly. So grammar can be an issue with vocabulary. As people are learning vocabulary, they'll apply grammar rules to their vocabulary learning, and so they are not sure if this is a vocabulary problem or a grammar problem. We often put on their paper that this is a word choice problem or a word form problem. So nouns, like plural forms and derivatives, when you put shun, it marks a noun. So no one can bear your demandation. It's too much. Sometimes this is from a translator that has incorrect forms, but sometimes it's just that they took a word that they know and then they added the plural, thinking that they could change this into a noun. And of course it's demands. Yeah, we cannot bear your demands. They're too much. But in this case, they probably just didn't even know how to use the word. Count and uncountable is a big problem. Transitive, intransitive, and irregular verbs can create problems. Don't pick up the flowers in the park. And, not understanding how we would actually phrase that in English. Adjective and adverbs can become problems when you add the Y. It makes me have a difficulty time. They'll add these too much and don't walk so fastly. So they kind of get confused about when do I add this, when do I make it an adverb, when do I make it an adjective. So if you see these types of words in your students' writing or you hear it, it could be a vocabulary problem with a grammar error. And there's also conversions. Nouns become verbs. That becomes complicated when you're doing that, and sometimes they're misusing the noun or the verb. Same meaning, different behavior. I didn't have much to speak. This is correct, but that's not how we say it, right? I definitely didn't have much to say. The beauty of teaching vocabulary is that it's fairly simple. There are just a couple ways that we do it. Vocab journals, flashcard games in class, quizzes, word puzzles, lots of whiteboard games like Hot Seat, Taboo, Hangman if they're low level, drawing pictures, Pictionary, charades. That's how we teach vocabulary. We just use it and do it, and we make time for it. We teach it in context, we make it fun and meaningful, and we include vocab in every lesson. We just see it as important. If you're doing that, you're teaching vocabulary. You don't actually need journals to have vocab journals. You can just have paper, or you could just have something on a computer. In fact, a lot of apps are out there for this, but I still use traditional journals to do vocabulary. With beginners, I use pictures and they copy words from the board. With intermediate students, I have them collect words from the classroom content that they want to learn and work on, and I have them build these charts using the word, the definition, and a translation, and sometimes different word forms, depending on the words that I'm having them work on. And with advanced students, I like them to use outside materials and in-class sources and create like kind of an elaborate chart with a lot of information, and I do a lot more vocabulary for advanced students because I think that's really one of the major differences between an intermediate and an advanced is that how much vocabulary they know. So I emphasize it more as they get stronger in their language. Here's visual examples. So when I was talking about the higher level, I would have the word like persist, and then I would have them write things around it to learn more about it. But with the lower levels, I usually do kind of these visual varied systems, and you can get these online and see them. They're like little printouts and things, but these are great ways to help encourage your students to do vocabulary learning actively within class and outside of class. Great homework assignment. And then you come in and you practice and you do kind of spelling bees and games really. Although they have a bad rep and people get tired of flashcards and your students tell you they don't need flashcards, particularly when they get to the intermediate advanced level, they tell you I don't need flashcards anymore. But actually flashcards are proven to be the very best way to increase your vocabulary. So creating flashcards out of note cards or paper, putting a hole punch or just sticking them together with a staple and going through those words, retrieving them again and again, using varied activities in your class, throwing the ball and having them say words, or having them play matching games, or having them stand up and hit the object and say the right word. All of these games are vocabulary games that are wonderful, that enforce and reinforce and recycle and just help your students expand their vocabulary. I hope that you enjoy teaching vocabulary, you see the value of it, and that you continue to expand your understanding of how to teach it.